U.S. President Donald Trump and his plans for leaving Syria are drawing fire tonight from both sides of the aisle in Washington, D.C. Senior congressional politicians, Democrats and Republicans, are calling on President Trump to reverse his decision to withdraw U.S. troops from northern Syria. The pullout will allow Turkey to launch a long-planned offensive against Kurdish fighters in the region, fighters that have been loyal allies of the United States in its fight against so-called Islamic State.
Leaving in a hurry, American troops started pulling out of Syria within hours of the official announcement. They leave behind them empty bases near the Turkish border, bases that had been a guarantee of safety for Kurdish forces. U.S. President Donald Trump abruptly canceled that guarantee by tweet. The Kurds fought with us, but were paid massive amounts of money and equipment to do so. They have been fighting Turkey for decades. It is time for us to get out of these ridiculous endless wars, many of them tribal, and bring our soldiers home. U.S. troops were in Syria to support Kurdish forces in the fight against the so-called Islamic State. But Turkey has long resented the presence of Kurdish paramilitaries near its border. It considers them terrorists. Kurdish groups in the region have protested the move. They feel abandoned by the U.S. And they fear a Turkish invasion is imminent.
This green light that Trump gave to Erdogan will actually complicate the crisis in the region. It will provide Islamic State with an opportunity to regenerate and control areas such as Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor again.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan gave the Kurds a stark warning.
There is a phrase that we always say: we can come any night without warning. And our determination remains, because it is absolutely out of the question for us to further tolerate the threats from these terrorist groups.
The international community has raised serious concerns.
Renewed armed hostilities in the northeast will not only exacerbate civilian suffering and lead to massive displacement, but will also risk severely undermining current political efforts, which we, as you know, support.
There are 6 million displaced people inside Syria. There is more than 5.5 million refugees in the neighboring countries. It's a conflict that has gone on for far too long, and therefore any operation that takes place at the moment has to take into account to ensure that we don't see any further displacement.
On the ground in Syria, Kurds are waiting for the next blow to fall in a region that's seen its share of misery and violence already.
And tonight, the situation has become even more confused as Trump has issued a threat to Turkey. Trump tweeted in the last couple of hours, "As I have stated strongly before, and just to reiterate, if Turkey does anything that I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, consider to be off limits, I will totally destroy and obliterate the economy of Turkey." All right, for more on this now, I'm joined by Jonathan Katz in Washington. He is a foreign policy analyst with the German Marshall Fund. Jonathan, it's good to see you again. Help us make sense of Donald Trump's Syria decisions. You know, within a few hours today, the U.S. president cleared the way for what is expected to be a Turkish assault against Kurdish fighters. At the same time, he threatens to destroy the Turkish economy if Turkey goes, quote, off limits in Syria. Which message are we supposed to believe?
Well, this is, again, a bit of the unpredictability of President Trump. And I think it highlights the challenge for U.S. foreign policy makers, decision makers in the Pentagon, in the White House, and elsewhere, that the president has once again, this is almost a repeat of what he did several months ago in announcing that U.S. troops are going to withdraw from Syria. So the question is, the President of the United States got on a phone call with President Erdogan, decided without talking to his top advisors in terms of what he's doing. He tweets out a policy, and then several hours later, realizing that the policy could harm those that the U.S. has worked with, has decided to reverse course and call for the destruction the Turkish economy. So I think a lot of people in Washington are head-scratching, but increasingly worried about the president's decision-making ability and what that means for U.S. national security, that of our partners, including Turkey.
And he is getting a lot of blowback, not only from Democrats in Washington, but also from Republicans and from some of his most loyal supporters, right?
Yeah. The interesting part of this is that the president has managed to anger at a time when I think he seems to be relying on their support politically during an impeachment inquiry process to anger some very senior Republican senators who have real concerns that the president is not only abandoning allies Kurds, but is leaving the U.S. vulnerable to ISIS again. What we know is that despite the fact that the geographic area where ISIS has operated doesn't exist, we know there still remains ISIS fighters. And so for any U.S. president to abandon both the strategic position but also allies sends a really difficult and wrong signal to those that we partner with. And I think that what you're seeing is an increasingly concern amongst members of Congress that these challenges are leaving the U.S. vulnerable.
And Jonathan, you know, since everyone now is talking about the president's conversations that he has with other heads of state, we know he talked with the Turkish president last night. What do you think Erdogan said to Trump, or what did he do to convince Trump to abandon the Kurds in Syria?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think everybody wants to see the transcripts of the conversation between President Trump and President Erdogan. And I think this is of deep concern in the U.S. right now, that the president is freewheeling in these diplomatic engagements. I don't think that President Erdogan said anything new to President Trump that he hasn't said before. And so the decision-making and the reasoning by President Trump and his tweet and his decision on this policy is a mystery to many here in Washington.
Jonathan Katz with the German Marshall Fund in our Washington studio. Jonathan, thank you very much. We appreciate your insights.
And the men were similarly dominant. Rai Benjamin anchored the team to the final gold of the championships to leave the US with a table-topping medal haul of 29.
All right, sports news now. The Rugby World Cup is...
This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Laura Trevelyan. The president declares he's pulling US troops from northern Syria and the pushback is immediate. Lawmakers from both sides accuse him of abandoning America's Kurdish allies. A diplomatic drama, why the US and Britain are clashing over granting immunity to a diplomat's wife who's involved in a deadly car crash. Plus, 2 American doctors share the Nobel Prize for Medicine with a British scientist. How their work with oxygen led to their win. For those watching on PBS and around the globe, welcome to World News America. Hours after President Trump announced he was pulling US forces from northern Syria, the backlash began. Lawmakers from both parties say America is abandoning its Kurdish allies, who were vital in the defeat of Islamic State, leaving them vulnerable when Turkey launches an offensive. Nikki Haley, former UN ambassador, said leaving allies to die is a big mistake. President Trump insists he's bringing troops home from what he calls the endless wars. The BBC's Ola Guerin has more.
A pullout at dawn. US troops leaving observation posts along the Syrian border. Washington says only a small number of troops were moved a short distance, but Kurdish forces fear they are clearing the way for a Turkish invasion. Turkey's president was viewing Serbian troops today, an honour guard on a state visit, as concerns grow internationally about what he's planning for northern Syria. Before leaving home, he seemed ready for unilateral action soon. We talked to the Americans last night, he said, and we'll keep talking. We have made a decision. And as we always say, we might come suddenly one night. That's a major threat for these Kurdish fighters from the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who have fought street to street against Islamic State, with help from the US. They've been Washington's key allies in battle, but with the US pullout, they believe they're being thrown to the wolves. They have vowed to resist any offensive and defend their land at all costs. Their spokesman, Mustafa Bali, told us that an attack by Turkey risks giving IS sleeper cells a chance to regroup and even retake some territory. From President Trump, a bellicose warning via his usual undiplomatic channel. If Turkey does anything that I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, consider to be off limits, I will totally destroy and obliterate the economy of Turkey. Just last month, American and Turkish troops were carrying out these joint patrols at the border. But now Ankara intends to go it alone, taking the battle to Kurdish forces it views as terrorists and a threat to its security. The Pentagon may be voicing concern, but Washington has no intention of getting caught in the crossfire.
Orla Guerin reporting. Well, Mara Karlin is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution who worked at the Syria Study Group. Experts asked by Congress to review US policy in Syria. She joined me a short time ago. Thanks for being with us. So, Syrian Kurdish forces have called this decision by President Trump to pull US forces out a stab in the back. Just how destabilizing is this?
This is a profoundly destabilizing move by President Trump. The U.S. relationship with the Kurds in Syria has been operationally effective against ISIS, and that's important to prevent against its resurgence. Precipitously announcing a withdrawal without consulting them or close U.S. allies in places like London and Paris is a real problem.
Now, it is being reported tonight by Newsweek that President Trump spoke with President Erdogan and was somehow out-negotiated. How could he have been outmaneuvered by Turkey's president on this one?
I don't know that he was outmaneuvered or out-negotiated. We have seen time and time again that President Trump does not want to be in places like Syria or in Afghanistan, and we see this through his tweets in particular. If you remember, just a few months ago in December, he made a not-so-different announcement and said that the U.S. was going to be leaving. It had found success in Syria. What's curious is that never actually came to fruition.
The president is now tweeting that if Turkey does anything off limits, he'll destroy their economy. But do you think that's going to prevent Turkey from launching an offensive?
The Turks have been threatening this incursion for years. It was only through sustained negotiation and diplomatic engagement that we were able to forestall this anyway, most recently through a joint security mechanism. They have real concerns about their security, and they are watching as forces in Syria that have different views are building up. What's pretty awful here is that the joint security mechanism between the Turks and between the U.S. military now appears to have perhaps even facilitated the Turkish incursion.
The president is facing massive pushback, including from his Republican allies, who are saying, in effect, he's giving the region to the bad guys. Is it possible that he walks this back?
It's entirely possible he walks this back. So he made the announcement in December via tweet, and yet the U.S. military still has a pretty decent-sized presence in Syria. So that is a possibility, especially given heavy congressional pressure. But his opponents are correct. The Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, Bashar al-Assad himself should be pretty excited about these events.
Well, what is it going to do to what remains of U.S. influence in Syria?
U.S. influence in Syria has been tottering for years. It is a complicated and ugly problem that a whole lot of folks just don't want to go near. The problem, frankly, in particular, is that the U.S. now isn't even playing a productive convening role. Instead, everyone is looking to the president's tweets to see what the latest U.S. policy announcement will be.
Mara Karlin, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
The United States says Turkey is set to launch a military operation against Kurdish fighters in northern Syria, and U.S. forces won't get involved. The White House made the announcement after a phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. It said U.S. forces will no longer be in the immediate area now that the Islamic State militant group has been defeated. President Trump defended the decision in a tweet, saying the Kurds were paid massive amounts of money. He added that it's time for the U.S. to get out of what he described as ridiculous, endless wars. Northern Syria is effectively under the control of Kurdish fighters. They fought the Islamic State group alongside U.S. forces. Yet Erdogan regards the Syrian Kurds as terrorists with ties to separatist Kurds in Turkey. He wants to establish a northern Syria safe zone to separate them from his country. Erdogan's spokesperson tweeted on Monday that Turkey is determined to follow through on this. A spokesperson for the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces tweeted that the U.S. forces are withdrawing from the border area and haven't fulfilled their responsibilities. The spokesperson said the Syrian Democratic Forces are ready to defend the area.
We're back with our experts. John Kirby, you served in the Navy for a long time. You're a retired admiral. What do you make of the president's sudden decision, all of a sudden, to announce he's pulling U.S. troops out of northern Syria?
Yeah, it seems like it's very much based on policy by grievance. If you looked at his tweet, it's all about how NATO's not doing enough, or European allies need to do enough. We've been over there too long. But it's not in the national security interest. If you believe ISIS is still a threat to American interests and to our allies and partners, which it is, and the military and the intelligence community say that, then you got to sustain the victory over them. You've destroyed them physically on the ground, yes, but you haven't destroyed them as a network. That's what those small troops were doing in Syria, to help defeat the network and to create a sustainable set of conditions that they couldn't resurge. So pulling them out like that, letting Turkey come in, that's only going to make it harder for the SDF, our allies, our Kurdish allies and friends, to fight ISIS, because they're going to be wanting, I'm sure, forced to react to Turkish incursions.
Swift bipartisan condemnation of the president's decision, including from obviously Republicans. Gloria, huge mistake, betraying an ally, disastrous, ensures ISIS comeback, short-sighted and irresponsible, a stain on America's honor, a catastrophic mistake, terribly unwise decision. I could go on.
Right.
These are from Republicans, including Republican leaders.
You know what I want to know? I want to know if General Mattis is going to say something at some point, because this is why he left. This is why he quit.
Yeah.
He said he couldn't agree with policy. It was shortly after the president announced his Syria policy. And I'm sure he agrees with all of these quotes that you just showed up on the screen. And I'm sure the president is kind of stewing, because he clearly wanted to change the subject from all of this, but he's changed the subject to something that is enormously unpopular. And Republicans, I think, don't, they can say this because, unlike with impeachment, there's no political price to Republicans for disagreeing with the president on Syria the way there is on Ukraine, in terms of they've got to support him on that. So here they are.
Also, some level of safety in numbers, too, by the way. I mean, one of the things that you'll see with impeachment is if they're going to jump, many of them will jump at the same time. You saw all of those statements come out this morning. But Gloria's exactly right. The difference between coming out in favor of impeachment versus coming out in favor of Syria, the American voter, by and large, does not make decisions based on where your senator or even your president's position is vis-a-vis Syria.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
But isn't it true that the public, not 100%, is more with Trump than with the politicians on this one? Do you think there's an enormous desire for our troops to be over in Syria for years more, to be in Afghanistan for almost 20 years? I mean, I think the president may have his finger on the pulse. Now, I don't know if it's in the national security interest, but I don't see this as a political negative for the president at all.
Yeah, it's certainly what he ran on, right? I mean, he sounded a bit like Rand Paul as he was running for the Republican nomination, and clearly got the Republican nomination and is in many ways governed in this way. And you saw Rand Paul come out and say, yes, that he agrees with this decision. A little, odd that it comes out at this point as the president is trying to, get Republicans to hold the line on Ukraine and not revolt. We've seen very few signs that any Republicans are going to break away from him in any serious way on the Ukraine scandal. But with this, we did see sort of Republicans remember who they are, right, in terms of national security policy, and just in terms of being hawks when it comes to national security.
And a reminder, I think, too, just to Nia's point, a reminder of how radically different Donald Trump's vision, I don't know if you call it conservatism, but Donald Trump's vision of Trumpism on the domestic and the international front is from traditional conservative policy proposals. Look at what George Bush said and did, George W. Bush versus Donald Trump. You would think they were not just from different parties, but from different planets in terms of their approach.
That would make him very happy to hear, by the way.
You know,
I will. Trump.
Yeah, he'll love that. No, and that's to Jeffrey's point. Politically speaking, he's probably right. People are sick of these foreign entanglements,
John,
but still.
I used to interview Donald Trump all the time before he became president of the United States, going back 20 years plus, and he's been on this issue. He's been very consistent. Get the troops out of Iraq. Get them out of Afghanistan. At that time, there were no troops in Syria. But he didn't even want troops in Japan or South Korea or Germany. Why are they there? Right. The United States is spending too much. He would say that consistently for the longest time.
Right. And look, I understand that many Americans are uncomfortable with troops being deployed in harm's way for extended periods of time. That's and many troops they're bearing the brunt of that. And I think they would appreciate a break as well. But there are some real significant pragmatic reasons for our national security to have them doing certain things. The footprint in Syria hasn't been that big. It's been very specifically targeted against ISIS, and ISIS was and remains a legitimate threat to our interest and those of our allies and partners.
Everybody stick around. There's a lot more news that's coming up